just a thrill to see so many folks here. And I can tell you from having sat with our faculty recently and met with our students how much this turnout means to those of us who are doing the business in the classroom and with the research and in the academy at all levels. I want to talk just a few minutes with you, if I may, before introducing our guest speakers, about what we're doing here tonight and the Luther Rice Society, Political Alliance, and the Entertainment and Media Alliance. This is something that is designed to bring together entertainment media, which it's sometimes entertaining up here on the Hill, don't you think? But mostly the entertainment media that's often resident on the West Coast, creating movies, animation, and the creative media that so drives our country and our culture and the world, together with the political and news media, which, as we know, is very heavily invested in this town, Washington, D.C. This is an opportunity for those of us who have strong connections with the George Washington University and with the School of Media and Public Affairs to come together and to network and to exchange ideas. And as we tell our students to really revel in the creativity and the technology that we're all about now, and that is so empowering of our citizens and our creative minds out there, to engage Washington and to engage the world, as Dean Barrett talks about, which we're trying to do every day in every way, to connect our citizens in this democracy with our lawmakers, which I know is music to your ears because you want to hear more from the citizens, but to make positive use of the media that we have, to use the media in these different ways, to elevate the debate where possible, to inform the electorate, to engage you with people in ways that will help you, we hope, to govern and to decide. The Luther Rice Society, as you know, is comprised of individuals who are generous and who are leaders and who help in many ways to support what we do at the George Washington University. And on behalf of everybody, I just want to thank you for that once again. You stimulate campus life, you would help us attract, through your support, quality faculty, and you support the cutting-edge research and the academic prestige and the diversity that is what we feel and hold so dear about our university and this town. I want to tell you that there is more information on the Luther Rice Society at the registration table. You can talk to any member of the GW staff, and they'll help steer you in that direction, and again, it's much appreciated. At the School of Media and Public Affairs, as I mentioned a moment ago, what we're really trying to do in many ways is challenge our students to adapt to an utterly changing media environment, to challenge our scholars to have impact on that environment and to help us understand it more, to analyze and synthesize and think critically about what's going on out there. And I hope to have some influence on the industry itself, to use the unique platform that is the School of Media and Public Affairs, the Columbian College for Arts and Science, the George Washington University, to reach across the disciplines and help to shape the debate, and it's a raging debate, as to where we are going as a media culture and how we interact more positively and how we engage the world more dramatically. I'm very proud to tell you that next week we're going to have former President Walter Mondale to talk about his life in politics at the School of Media and Public Affairs, and then we want to engage a conversation about America's role in the world, smart power, if it's smart, and we actually will be having Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates join us in Lisner Auditorium for what should be a really remarkable conversation. At this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you several people who are important and near and dear to all of us. I want to start with our President, President Steven Knapp, if that's okay.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to greet so many of you here this evening in this beautiful venue, which I'm very pleased to say this is the first time we're having an event, first event ever held in this room since it has been renamed in honor of the three great leaders as the Kennedy Caucus Room, named after John, Robert, and Edward. So it's a great honor for us to be here with you this evening, and I'm glad to see that we have so many alumni, some of whom have traveled from quite a distance just to be with us this evening. We also have, I've met a few parents of current as well as parents of former students who are part of the Luther Rice Society, and I've also met a number of our students who have come up the hill here to be with us this evening. We have a number of university leaders here. In addition, you've just met one of them, our new director of our School of Media and Public Affairs, Frank Sesno. We also have Peg Barrett, the Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences, with us today. And Chris Arterton is here, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Political Management. Chris, right over here. Lorraine Voles, who is the Vice President for External Relations. Lorraine's out here somewhere. Here's Lorraine. And I really do want to recognize, because I think the creative reshaping of the Luther Rice Society and this very innovative structure that now involves alliances in 4 different areas, in real estate, in finance, as well as the 2 that we're celebrating this evening, in entertainment and media, and the newest one now in politics. This is really something that's been developed by our new Associate Vice President, I shouldn't say new, she's been here now for 2 years, Adrian Rolnick, who's here, Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations. Adrian. And of course, as many of you know in the Luther Rice Society, Seth Rosenzweig, who's right in the back of the room here, and really is the kind of the brains behind this operation. We've had a very exciting opening of our year here at the George Washington University. And we're only a couple of weeks, actually just beginning the 3rd week of our semester, but we already have had, I think, the pleasure of introducing to our campus one of the largest and most academically qualified classes we have ever recruited. We had more than 20,000 applications for what is now a class of 2,500. It's a little larger than we had anticipated because we had expected in the economic situation, as it's unfolded, that there might be a summer melt a little larger than usual. So the interesting thing is we had so many applications last year that we admitted exactly the same percentage of students as the previous year. We kept the same level of selectivity, but we ended up with somewhat more students because the pool was larger, and there was less of a melt, and that's why we're up at 2,500, which is actually a few hundred more students than we planned on. Brings us in just below the cap on enrollment that we negotiated with the District of Columbia. So it was a little like watching water go up the levee there. But it worked out actually splendidly, so that we have an extraordinary, talented, engaged class. And to tell you something about their engagement, this past Friday, in keeping with the President's emphasis on commemorating the September 11th tragedy with a National Day of Service, we had a Freshman Day of Service on our campus here and across the university. And on the Foggy Bottom campus, we had, and in the university yard, 1,400 freshmen who gathered in the morning, and I was part of a ceremony that sent them off. They fanned out across the city to perform public service projects around the District of Columbia. And that same day, and I hope most of you have heard this by now, but in case you haven't, First Lady Michelle Obama issued a challenge to our university, which is that if we would complete 100,000 hours of public service in the course of this academic year, and I assure you that we will, and if we get close and we're not there in those last couple of weeks, I'm going to be out cleaning up every park in the District of Columbia. She will be our commencement speaker in May on the National Mall. I mean, in the first place, it's really great to have that decision resolved in the first 2 weeks of a semester, because it can be a source of suspense late in the year. But of course, it's a terrific symbol of what it means to be a university so deeply and strongly engaged with public life, public service, with politics, with media, with everything it means to be at the heart of a vital national capital that is also a global capital here in the heart of Washington, D.C. And that's what really draws our students. That's what inspires their passion to come to an institution like this where they can take advantage of everything that we have to offer. And of course, that passion is reflected in our alumni, who really are visible in so many walks of life here in the nation's capital, where we have 14 members of Congress, 5 senators, 4 representatives who are alumni of our university. You're going to hear from one of those in just a moment. But it is, I think, a real testament to the strength of a university in the heart of the nation's capital, where we do have an aspiration to become ever stronger, more powerful in the contribution we make to address the issues that are so challenging in our nation and around the world. And we have the students, we have the faculty, we have the leadership here, that many of whom I've just introduced to you, that are going to enable us to do that. And it's now my pleasure, and this is really my role here, to introduce one of the most distinguished alumni our university has produced, someone who is truly first of all, started out as a leader in business, and more recently has been a leader in public life, a graduate with a degree in political science in the class of 1977, graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Also actually a double degree holder, because in 2003 he received an honorary degree as Doctor of Public Service. Also someone who is known for an extraordinarily successful term as governor of the great Commonwealth of Virginia, where he served from 2002 to 2006. When he started as governor, the state had a $6 billion deficit. Within a couple of years, that had been turned into a surplus, and the state was ranked #1 in the nation as the best managed state. The Commonwealth was the best managed state in the nation, ranked that way by the Pew Charitable Trust. And of course, he went on from that very successful term as governor to be elected in 2008 as a senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia. He really needs no introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Senator Mark Warner.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction. Thank you for the great leadership you're providing to George Washington University. It is, you can feel the energy at GW these days. For a long time, the greatest thing GW had was location, location, location. Now we've moved in so many ways beyond that under the distinguished leadership of President Knapp, bringing out these new programs, these new initiatives. Congratulations to my good friend Frank Sesno for joining this institution as a dean, important role. I am interested in this school, public affairs and media. You know, I guess I'm the public affairs part. Dana is the media part, right? Dana Bash, who we're going to hear from in a few moments. She's the one with the camera. I'm the person pushing everybody aside to try to get in front of the camera. That's how you note the politicians away from the media folks. But to be here tonight with so many members of the Luther Rice Society, so many young alumni as well who are participating in this program, initiative, the chance to network, to get to know each other. President Knapp mentioned this as well, but it's pretty special to be in this room tonight, the first function ever held in the Kennedy Caucus room. I've spent my experiences at GW in many ways. The reason I'm up here talking to you as a senator tonight is because of the experiences I had at George Washington. I was the first and only member of my family to graduate from college. I always had a little bit of a political bug, and you know, I've kind of gone full circle. I started as an intern on Capitol Hill for Chris Dodd, actually as a sophomore. I'd worked for Abe Ribicoff 1 year before that, but as a sophomore for Chris Dodd, and now, you know, I have come around 30 years later, and I am one of the junior members on the banking committee, of which he's still the chairman. It doesn't mean I still have to get him coffee anymore, but there is some of that relationship hasn't totally changed. But you know, the wonderful opportunity that GW gives to expose you to you know, the incredible things that happen in this world-class city. And as Frank's earlier comments, that the challenge, I think particularly for his school, in terms of how we make some sense of the intersection between media, entertainment, public affairs, how we do this in a way that is relatively civil and informed, something that perhaps some of our colleagues could get a lesson in, is terribly, terribly important. So I commend all of you who participate in the Luther Rice Society. I think it is a great chance to network, to get informed, to continue to get exposed to the wonderful assets at the university. There are wonderful values in this, and GW continues to present that opportunity for recent alums to get involved. Where's Ricky Parikh? Ricky, in the back of the room, is a young GW grad who works with me now in my communications department, and he gave me one incredible piece of advice before I came up here today. He said, "Senator, please don't tell the green polyester suit story." But Dana, being an inquiring mind in the media, I know has probably wanted to know that, you know. As a young GW student in that freshman and sophomore year, I used to, I had one suit that was green polyester, which was actually relatively fashionable in 1974 and 73. Actually, no, it wasn't even fashionable then, but you know, I would ride my bike up, and the wonderful thing about this suit is you could actually, you know, wring it out afterwards and put it back on, and it dried very quickly. So I won't tell that story, Ricky, but I will mention coming into this Kennedy Caucus room, and to show how far GW has come from when I was a student to when you all who are recent grads, and I had the honor to serve on GW's board for about 7 or 8 years before I took the plunge into public service and served as governor and now senator. But the GW of today is much different than the GW of 30-odd years ago. And one of the major distinctions that I've noticed, differences, is you know, the quality of student life and the wonderful feel that the campus has again. And one of the areas that are particularly different was the food service. I can remember the old contract food from in Thurston Hall, and it was so god-awful dreadful that I will fully acknowledge one more story that, Rick, you've never actually heard, that when I was a GW freshman and sophomore, and I actually worked all 4 years on Capitol Hill, helped me pay my way through college. One of the ways that I managed to save those kind of resources was wearing that green polyester suit. I would always, and this is a good piece of advice for recent grads who are still paying off student loans, I would stuff plastic bags in all of my pockets and cruise all the Capitol Hill receptions as a young intern. You know, and some fried wontons and cocktail shrimp going back made you a great hit back at Thurston after an evening of grazing to go back to your roommates and friends. But so, you know, I'm not necessarily advocating those same grazing techniques for recent grads, but it is one more part, at least, of my GW's experience, and it was the chance to get exposed to a whole host of folks across all different parts of life that made this, at that point, young guy from Connecticut's interest in politics turn into a passion and turn into a recognition that with all of the flaws of the system and all of the flaws of this institution, it's still an incredible combination of Americans of different beliefs, backgrounds, where we come together and, as imperfectly as it sometimes appears in the news media, try to do the right thing for the country. And the opportunity to be in this city gave me that exposure that prompted that, again, initial interest into a passion that has become hopefully the goal and purpose of at least my professional life. And I would say, as a member of the Lutherized Society, the opportunities you get, particularly as a young alum, to network, to take advantage of you know, not only some of these other areas, but now the entertainment area and the politics area as two new more categories is a wonderful additional step of how your GW education is going to continue to pay off for you, I know, for many decades to come. So congratulations again, Steve, for your leadership at the university. Dana, it is wonderful to see you again, and I apologize about not being able to stay for your comments. One other thing about being a senator is not only do you have to graze a lot of these, but you don't have control of your schedule. But I want to commend everybody involved in the university in this step forward, and go Colonials. Thank you all very much. The other part of this job that I have mastered in my 8 months, I may not have every policy prescription exactly memorized, but I have absolutely mastered the playbook.
Before you run off, we do have something we want you to remember us and this moment by, and we get another picture out of the deal. And the only question I have for Senator Warner, as a fellow 1977 graduate, was your green polyester suit or my brown corduroy suit? Which one was more flammable? That's all. We'd like to present this on behalf of the George Washington University and the Luther Rice Society. And President Knapp, perhaps I think a picture.
Well, you know, one of the things, too,
It's not truck.
what it is, but the one thing that's different, when you were governor of Virginia, the only thing you got whenever you came to these kind of events was Jefferson cups. So this is kind of
Senator Warner, thank you very, very much. I must say that of all the many parts of the job that I now have and the time that I've spent at the George Washington University that are rewarding, the most rewarding is to see the sparkle, the light goes on in young people as they look out over this city and consider their options and the opportunities that are available to them through the university, through their experiences, through these incredible internships. And here a few years later, you know, a United States Senator stands. And in a moment, a tremendous and I think growing journalist stands. Dana Bash, and I go back a fair bit, actually. She'll tell you a little bit more of this, but she started in the tape library, and now she's on TV 27 times a day because it's CNN. And she's also online, and she's on radio, and she's on podcast because that is what the media world has become. And the journalist today has to be incredibly skilled at actually doing the reporting, speaking to sources, understanding where the news is, and then turning it into English so that it's understandable and compelling, and then being able to connect with it across a 24/7 spectrum of all these different media platforms. It has been such a pleasure to watch the sparkle in Dana from the days when we first started together as babies at CNN, and to watch her growth and to see the voice that she has developed for herself and for all of us on national and international television and web. We worked together on the Sunday show when I was hosting the show. And now she's, even though I'm not there anymore and that Sunday show is gone, she's still married to Sunday morning television, or Sunday afternoon, to Sunday television. Her husband, John King, is with us. I know you know John from seeing him through politics. And the magic wall that John helped popularize at CNN. You've seen that, the magic wall, the electoral. Can you imagine what it's like at the King Bash household? Now, for dinner tonight, we've got broccoli, or the touch screen, and then there it is. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dana Bash.
Well, it's too bad Senator Warner left because he can't hear me tell the reality of when I was in school, and that is if anybody showed up anywhere wearing a green polyester suit, it either would have been 70s night or Halloween. Because the uniform when I was in school in the early 90s was white t-shirt with a V-neck, jeans, black cowboy boots, and a black blazer, and that was it. Anybody who was there in the early 90s, you could not walk down the streets of the GW campus without seeing that, especially in those of us ladies who were there. First of all, I just want to say what an incredible honor it is to be introduced by Frank. Frank said that we certainly have gone back many, many years. But what he didn't tell you is that actually my career at CNN started while I was at GW. And that day that it started, I was working for an anchor named Frank Sesno. And here's what happened. I was in my second semester of my senior year. And I'd already done several internships around town and in New York as well. But I thought it was time. I was getting close to graduating, and I'd had a lot of internships that I wanted to try to get paid. So somehow I finagled my way into doing some vacation relief work at CNN. But when I got there on my very first day, I was told that I had to do something that I'd never trained for, which is, now that I have been at CNN for a long time, I know is pretty typical. And that job was ripping scripts and overseeing a teleprompter for the program that Frank was anchoring. Well, sure enough, the teleprompter was completely messed up, my fault. The scripts were completely and totally out of order, and what Frank was supposed to be reading on the teleprompter made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But luckily, since Frank was such a pro, you had no idea that there was a problem. But afterwards, I can tell you that I hid. I absolutely hid, and I thought, oh my God, I'm still in school. I haven't even graduated from college yet, and my career is over. It was definitely one of those, stomach-hurting experiences. But luckily, somehow I got past that. As Frank said, I got a job actually just about a month after I graduated in the CNN tape library, and I worked there for 9 months before I became an associate producer on the weekend public affairs shows, as Frank mentioned, and one of those was Frank's shows. At Frank's show, and I was able to learn from him and watch him every single day, which, in a professional environment was wonderful. And I just think that it's just spectacular that in an academic environment, students at GW are going to experience what I got to experience. So it's really fabulous. Since then, that was just a few years ago, I have been lucky enough to have some tremendous experiences at CNN. I've covered several presidential campaigns, including last year I covered John McCain's presidential campaign. I covered lots of congressional races. I covered the White House for nearly 4 years. I got to travel the world on that beat, and as Wolf Blitzer likes to say, I got a front row seat to history, certainly there. And now, of course, I spend all of my time covering Congress. I pound the marble out there, and I chase after senators, like Senator Warner. I chase after congressmen, and I get to cover the big debates of our time. In fact, I just came from a live shot that I did on the latest developments on healthcare, which is really reaching a critical point in the Senate. But, the only reason I got to work at CNN, really, and get my foot in the door as vacation relief, and the reason I got to do that is because I was able to say I had internships. The reason why I was able to get those is because I was at GW. I was in Washington, and I got a lot of those internships because the professors at GW, they kept in touch with their former students. And I was lucky because they were pretty aggressive about keeping in touch with those former students and finding out when they needed help. And for example, Jerry Mannheim, who I knew very well at school, Steve Roberts, they were two people who really did keep in touch and tried to get a sense of what we wanted to do as students and who they could place us with. But really, the reality was, at the time, I got great experiences, and many of my friends in school got those experiences, but it was a very informal process that led to that. And there wasn't a formal network, really, that I knew about that allowed us to really connect with the very long list of GW alumni that are, obviously all around the country and the world, but particularly in this city. So that's why I really do think it's wonderful that the Luther Rice Society has launched this political alliance, this entertainment and media alliance, and I'm honored now that I am able to serve on the board. So I really do hope to reestablish my roots. I'm a local. I've been here since I graduated from school, and to really give back to a place that was so central in my life, and hopefully offer some words of encouragement, some advice, maybe some warnings to the students who are getting ready to graduate, and really engage with them and give them the guidance that I sort of look for from people who were doing what I wanted to do. So I do cherish that, and I hope to be able to continue that in the days, weeks, months, years ahead. Thank you.
Jana, we want to present you as well with a token and a remembrance. You can have the envelope, please. I was just called by Channel 9, and they popped an interview out on the street. Did I think that you all familiar with the Kanye West, Barack Obama thing? And he's a jackass, and should they have put that tape out? And should the president have known, is he ever off the record? John, is the president off the record? He thinks so. It's a microphone. You know, microphones do that, and unless you say it's off the record, right? Sadly enough, locked and loaded. It's just wonderful to hear, and I hope for you to hear Dana and hear Dana's stories and how she wove her work in the classroom and in the newsroom from the George Washington University to her career at CNN. But there are some, actually, who don't wait for the internship and don't wait for the job. We have two current students, Andrew and John, who are doing a program called The Political Pulse. It's on GW Online, Saturdays 4 to 6. He's learning. And they're already interviewing senators and people in the political sphere. They're already engaging the world and engaging these issues. So this is something we're just so proud of and is so really terrific to see. Dana has developed a voice, and this is what we encourage our students to do. And it's now a tremendous privilege to introduce somebody who I think has one of the most unique voices in this country. I've known David Gergen since I was 3 and started covering Ronald Reagan, and David was 16 and was working as a communications director was the position there at the White House. David has worked for several presidents of both parties. David somehow manages, in the sort of cacophony and crash of the cable world, to have a voice of reason and have a voice of not dispassion, but detachment that's still attached somehow. Because he's fair to both sides, I think his analysis is some of the clearest and most compelling and yet succinct on television. And he speaks reasonably. Imagine that. David, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the podium. David Gergen.
Good evening. It's an honor to join all of you this evening on this special salute, this special occasion, when we're inaugurating not only this chamber as the Kennedy Caucus Room. A lot of history has already occurred here, more to come, but also saluting your alumni and saluting this new alliance between the political and media sides of your university. All of you know, I think, that one of Thomas Jefferson's biggest dreams was to create a university in Charlottesville. And of course, that has come to fruition. All of us have enormous admiration for the University of Virginia. Some people do not always remember that it was one of George Washington's biggest dreams, was to create the country's leading university here in Washington, D.C. And I think that what we have seen here tonight and what all of you know is not there yet, but it's making great strides, And this university's reputation is growing rapidly. The fresh leadership of Steve Knapp and others who have worked so hard over the years to build this is something that is, I think, that the country is coming to understand and to appreciate how important it is in the political center of the country to also have much of the intellectual center and vitality of the country to be in the same place, because each refreshes the other. John Kennedy, in his last speech, the speech that he never gave back in 1963, said that learning and leadership are indispensable to each other. Learning and leadership are indispensable to each other. And I think here tonight, when you saw Mark Warner, Dana Bash, the president, and Frank Sesno, you got a sense of the quality of this institution, how it's changed and grown over the years. Let me say a word about Frank Sesno. Let me say a word about his predecessor, Lee Huebner, who happens to be an old friend. We worked together back in the 1970s in the trenches together. He went on to be the publisher of the International Herald Tribune. Came back to this country and in effect came back from Europe because he wanted his kids to get an education here in this country later on. A wonderful, wonderful man. And now to have Frank Sesno succeeding him, I think you've gone from strength to strength, to mountaintop to mountaintop. So I congratulate you on that. Now, I must say that as you bring together politics and the media, I am reminded of a story that I think I first heard from a journalist with ABC News about three fellows who were out hiking through the mountains of North Carolina, my home state. And as dusk came, they were looking for a place to stay overnight. And they looked around for some sort of B&B or whatever they could find. They couldn't find anything. And finally, they found a farmer and asked him if he could put them up. And the farmer said, well, gentlemen, I'm glad to put you up, but please know, I only have 2 beds. I do have a stall in my barn where the third person will have to sleep tonight. And they said, well, under the circumstances, they would accept that. Well, these 3 guys, one of them was an ambassador to the United Nations, the second one was a White House counselor, and the third was a journalist. And so as night came, as dark came, the ambassador, appreciating etiquette better than anyone else, said he guessed he'd be glad to go to the barn, and off he went into the night. And about 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and it was the ambassador. He said, I'm very sorry. There's a cow in that barn, and I'm Hindu. I couldn't possibly sleep in that barn overnight. Oh, the White House counselor got it and said, well, I guess I'll go to the barn. So off he went into the night. About 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and it was the White House counselor. He said, I'm very sorry. There's a pig in that barn, and I'm an Orthodox Jew. I couldn't possibly sleep in that barn overnight. So the journalist got up, scratched, belched, said, all right, damn it, I know when I've been had, and off he went into the night. And about 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and sure enough, it was the cow and the pig. So please understand that there is this mix is not always a happy one. We like to get ours back. For those of us who work on the journalistic vineyard, like to get ours back. It goes back to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, as I think it was Bill Moyer said, he didn't have a credibility gap. He had a canyon, and there was always this question about how could you tell whether Lyndon Johnson was telling the truth. And finally, a journalist came up with the answer. He said, Lyndon Johnson's like a baseball manager. And if he's pulling on his right earlobe, that means he's telling the truth. Or if he's pulling on the left part of his jacket, that means he's telling his truth. But when his lips begin to move, I used to remind a lot of my friends in government that is a widespread view of journalism, of journalists, of people who work in government. So it works both ways. This is not an easy alliance, but it's a very important one. And I want to suggest, as you launch tonight, perhaps one charge, Frank, and for others who are involved in this, that you might want to think about. And it comes up in the context of something that Dana and John King and I have been, and many of you in this room have really been riveted by in the last few months, and that is this debate over health care and health care reform. I think this debate raises a larger point now about the future of the country. We've been at this question of reforming the healthcare system for 3/4 of a century. 8 different presidents have tried to bring national health insurance to this country, most of them Democrats. In fact, every Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt. One Republican was very dedicated to that, Richard Nixon. And it was Nixon's ideas, in fact, that as Teddy Kennedy once said, his greatest regret was he didn't take Nixon up on it because maybe it could have been done way back then. But we're the only country in the world, in the Western civilized world, that does not insure our citizens. And so there's been this question about why couldn't America get this done? And it's been a long time. We've made, starts and stops along the way. And we've covered, Medicare, covered our senior citizens. S-CHIP covered a lot of our kids. We've made progress here and there, but we're still a long way, as the whole country knows. And I would suggest to you that this evening, we may be on the eve of a historic breakthrough. We may be finally about to get a bill. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. One is, I think that the citizens of the country are ready for change. Almost every American knows the system we now have is unsustainable, both for cost purposes and for accessibility purposes. It's also true that the various interests who have opposed this bill in the past are much more in support of it now because they can't sustain this system either. All of the stakeholders, the insurance companies, the hospitals, the doctors, others who are in the system now feel, the pharmaceutical companies, you can go down through the list. I remember I was there in the White House when President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton tried to get health care reform through in 93, 94. And we had a fierce resistance from small business, from the insurance company. You know, David Broder and Haynes Johnson wrote a very good book that I would commend to you called The System, about what happened. And these crypto political parties, as they call them, grew up and opposed health care reform. Well, that's all changed. This time around, they're at the table, they're willing to play, and they're being being much more constructive about it than they have been in the past. We had two elections, the 2006 election and 2008 election, that brought a lot more Democrats to Congress. And also, by the way, the 2006 elections were the first ones to send a signal to the various stakeholders. Things are changing. Healthcare is coming back. Healthcare reform is going to be on the table again. You better think about it. And then 2008 election drove them over the side. And then, of course, we have a president who is very passionate and articulate about healthcare. There's a new book out called The Heart of Power, which I would commend to you, on the history of these last 75 years of various presidents trying to get healthcare reform done. And one of the central points in that book, which was well reviewed in the New York Times book review section a couple of weeks ago, one of the central points is the president has to be for it. It has to be deep in his gut, and he has to be for it and go out and fight for it. And this president clearly is passionate about it. And he's unusually articulate in the Oval Office. He's a president. It's not very often that a president can give a speech about economics or about healthcare, complex subjects, and make them understandable. Lyndon Johnson famously said when Jack Valenti told this story way back in the past, back in the 60s when he was president, and Ken Galbraith came in to argue to President Johnson that he really ought to go out and make a national major speech on television about the economy. And Lyndon looked at him and said, Ken, let me tell you something about what it's like for a president to make a speech about the economy. It's about a fellow who pees down his leg. It makes him feel warm, but everybody else wonders what the hell's going on. Captures well the elevated conversations that occur in the White House and the Oval Office. Taping systems are a good thing that have left in the past. Well, here comes Barack Obama, and he's able to give, as he did last week, a very strong speech that has rallied his troops. So what we find is that there's more alignment for health care reform than at any time I can remember in this city in the last 30 plus years that I've been running around here, 40 years almost now. And in all of that, there is a sense of we're about to change. Now, but, what you also see is a lot of resistance that is sprung up. That's very tough, very, almost vitriolic, shrill, and sometimes vicious. And what is going on here, given all the alignment that we've seen the vote for change? And this is going to bring me to the political and communications question that I think we face. Well, in part, as students and as alumni of this university, you know it's important always to understand context. And the context, in part, is that this nation is not France. It is not the UK. It is not Canada. We do have a different value structure in America. Seymour Martin Lipset, who used to teach in this area, a famous sociologist, wrote a book about American exceptionalism. Not that America was exceptionally better, but America is an outlier nation in terms of our value structure. We put much greater stress on individualism, much greater stress on laissez-faire. We've never had a strong socialist party in this country. We have never embraced a lot of the values of other Western nations which grew up with feudalism and a strong church, and there's a long, long story behind this. But if you take the difference between Canada and the United States, about 35 years ago, the Canadian government and the American government announced at almost the same time that 15 years later, they would the country would move to the metric system. And if you go to Canada now you will see that almost all the signs are for kilometers. You see any kilometer signs around the United States? Well, why is that? Well, the Canadians come from a different culture, one that is more deferential toward authority. Okay, the government announced we're going to go metric. Okay, must be for a good reason. We'll try it. Let's try it. Americans are told you got to go metric. They can't understand it. Their view, no metric. We ain't going there. That's the way we are, and that is part of our culture. And it has made us, that culture has given us a vibrancy and a entrepreneurial spirit and a sort of, we're much more creative. It's been one of our great strengths. It has also meant we have a much smaller safety net. The individualism has led to a much higher divorce rate. We have much higher rates of incarceration. We have a lot of other things. It's a double-edged sword. Our value structure is, all value structures are double-edged swords. But we're different, and you have to appreciate that. There's been some other things about the politics about this. The president turning this over to Congress, and I think in retrospect was a mistake. I think the White House should have maintained more control and a partnership with the Congress in order to get health care done. But there is also something else now that a lot of us are trying to deal with, and that is there is, with all of these town halls and the demonstrations this weekend in Washington, there's something clearly deeper going on. The president knows that. He gets that. There's a deeper anxiety about the direction of the country. But just as importantly, there is a growing unwillingness to listen to each other. There's a growing sense that if you're not like me, there is something wrong with you. And I think you're un-American if you're not like me. And by the way, there are some people who believe if you're not my same color as my skin, maybe there's something wrong with you. There's a little racism in here. It's not driven by racism, but there's some racism mixed in here. There's a sort of distrust of government that's very pervasive now. A sense that we spend a lot of money, what are the results? The stimulus package has only been the latest example. Why should we entrust you with more funds? Why should we entrust you with more control? This isn't a great system. I'd like to change it, but I don't trust you to change it because it'll get worse. And what's happened is, of course, and the president comes on 60 Minutes on Sunday night with Steve Croft, and he makes the argument there's been a coarsening of our political discourse, a coarsening of our culture. He's right about that. We all know that. And then he goes on to say, this 24-hour television that we're seeing, especially on cable, is encouraging all the extreme people in the system to get airtime. And of course, the internet has encouraged this. The blogosphere has encouraged this. There's a certain vicious, the internet is a double-edged sword too, as we're all learning. It can be very edifying. It can be very helpful, very informative. And it also can be a sewage line. And it's been a place where there's a lot of trashing going on. There's a lot of trash talk. And that trash talk seeps over into the popular talk. And that has contributed to the coarsening. And I think the question that some of us are beginning to face, as I talk to old hands in Washington, I frankly cannot remember a time when we've been this bitterly divided at each other's throats as we have been in the last few weeks, indeed in the last few months. And I think we saw a lot of this in the Bush years. This is not a partisan statement. It's not about one side or the other. There was a lot of bitterness toward George W. Bush. There was a huge amount of polarization during the Bush years. But I thought that was the limit. I never thought we'd get beyond that. I think we're seeing even more polarization now than we saw before. I can't remember this kind of divisiveness and bitterness since the 1960s. I think we've had episodes, but this is getting pretty deeply ingrained now. And in some ways, I think it threatens democracy when you can't have civil discourse, not only sort of in public, but on the airwaves. In a way that encourages people to listen to each other and work this through. We are a great nation. We've had a history of being a great nation. Other nations are rising now. Fareed Zakaria talks about the rise of the rest in Asia. And if you go outside the United States, you'll find a lot of people talking about China as the future. Everybody knows that China, India, Japan are rising. But the issue is going to be as they rise, and we're not going to stop that, that's going to happen. The question is going to be in 20 or 30 years when they're at the table, are we still going to be at the table? Or are we not only going to see a relative decline, but an absolute decline in America? And I think that's what the president was trying to get at the end of his speech last week, when he said this has a lot to do with the character of the nation. And he read that Vicki Kennedy sent that letter from Teddy Kennedy, and he read that very moving passage. It was the right question, and I think a number of us are starting to ask, are we getting back into the situation where we don't think we're very governable? I think it's much bigger than healthcare. I think it has a lot to do with the quality of our capacity to govern ourselves and to address the big issues, whether it be in healthcare or our competitiveness, our innovation, in our schools, in climate and energy. All of these are very pressing issues that, as well as Afghanistan and all those other kind of issues. If we don't deal with these issues well, if we're not able to govern ourselves as a republic, as a Jefferson and a Washington could do, I guarantee you, we're going down. It is a very stark situation. We have to either address these issues or accept the fact we're not who we thought we were. And I don't think the younger generation is prepared to do that. But I will tell you, because a lot of you represent the younger generation, if you want to have a good future for your kids and your grandkids, you're going to have to fight for it. It goes back to this national service business. 9/11 was an important day to remember national service. I'm delighted Michelle Obama's coming to GW, because I really do think she'll be an inspiration and a prod, in fact, a stimulant. But all of us, this national service, that was passed in the Kennedy bill, and it was passed in the first 100 days of administration to expand AmeriCorps, is a very important thing. It is a way to restore a civic culture. But I would suggest to you it is a major way to do it, but it's not the only way. And the issue, I think the challenge for this alliance, one challenge for this alliance is, can you come to grips with these questions of how we have a political and media culture that is healthy, that allows robust debate, that makes, as the president said on Sunday night, how do we make civility interesting? Now, I happen to believe that CNN has a role to play in that. I think it has a significant role to play in that, because it is, Frank Sesno has tried to build this, John King, Dana, and others have been trying very hard to make this. It's not the only place, but it is one of the places that I think we have to build. But I would suggest to you the challenge for all of us is, how do we come to grips with this question of our culture, our political culture, our media culture, the marriage of those cultures, and what we get at the end of the day that allows this country to once again have a sense of the kind of promise we felt as a people. We felt it right after 9/11 when everybody came together. It was there was a moment of unity when people really sensed that. There was another moment the day Barack Obama was inaugurated, when there was a glow in this city and a sense of goodwill, and people of different views sort of said, maybe we can all make this work. And we're losing that right now. We're losing that glow. And I think the question becomes not only how we can relight the candle, but how we keep that flame burning for the years ahead. And that, to me, if you all, with George Washington University, can help us come to grips with that, it would be a huge contribution to the country, and it would help to fulfill George Washington's dream. Thank you very much. I know Mark Warner said that one thing, if you're a journalist, if you're in Washington, you do not want to get between a senator and a camera. It's the most dangerous place in the world to be. And as a speaker, I don't want to get between you and drink and food. So, but I'm happy to take a couple of questions or comments or whatever. Yes, sir. What did you want to say about the first one? The delicate issue of racism. Well, let me just say, I appreciate that. I struggle with this question of racism. Coming from the South, I think it should be said for starters that we are so much better today than we used to be on this question. You know, people, lay off on Joe Wilson about South Carolina. Politics of South Carolina are just light years away from what they were. And people say, why are all these crazy people coming out of South Carolina? Why do we have so much anger out of South Carolina? Well, South Carolina has also given us Dick Riley. It gave us Fritz Hollings. It gave us Lindsey Graham. There are some people who come out of South Carolina who are quite statesmanlike and care about the country. So, and I see this from North Carolina. I can tell you Barack Obama would never have won North Carolina. Wouldn't have come close in the primary, 25 years ago. So we have come a long way. But it is clear, especially in the midst of economic hard times, that some of the darker sides emerge, and people express their frustrations in ways in which I think there often is a latent racism, and I think there's sometimes it's not so latent. And there are still people, there's no question about it. I was just in Texas this past week in Dallas, and I was told there, as I talked to various leading citizens, there are some people in that part of the world, as there are and elsewhere in the country, who are still trying to come to grips with the fact we have an African-American president, and they're not quite satisfied with it. I also think, but I don't think it's necessarily what the main driver is. John King, who travels the country for his show, and I'd welcome his comments and thoughts on this because I think it would contribute to the conversation. And he knows this so well. I think there's I think it's the economics and the frustrations that are really driving it, and it happens to be a way to go after Barack Obama more than the heart of it. And it is a way to delegitimize it. And that's what's going on here. But we've seen this before, by the way. I was talking with someone in the White House in the last 24 hours who said, as Democrats, we tried to delegitimize George Bush Sr. way back when because we thought he won the campaign but won it unfairly against Michael Caucus. And I can tell you there were people who went after Bill Clinton and tried to delegitimize him. And there were people who really went after George Bush Jr. after the 2000 election because they thought he stole the election, or the Republicans had stolen the election. So this is not new. I think it has reached a viciousness that we have not seen. And I think it is tinged with racism, but I wouldn't say it's the driver. I would hate to go that far. I don't think that's where we are. And those of us who had great fears in the election about how the vote, you remember we always worried about the Bradley effect in the election? That didn't show up in the voting. So I think we ought to be very careful about just sort of how we describe this. But John, did you have thoughts on this? This is John King, who's the host of, here he is, Sunday morning with John King. State of the Union, John King. I don't want to call him unique, but I think it's very special that it's very comfortable just to sit here in the D.C. inside the Beltway and report and to go out and do things. I mean, he is making it a point to go out into the country and talk to people every week and understand the country in a broader sense. And I think that contributes an awful lot to the strength of his journalism. Let me just say, you asked a second question about Fox, Look, I think it's inappropriate for me to sit here and criticize Fox. It's not my favorite cup of tea, but it's not, I think it's inappropriate. I think rather than being critical, I think the question is, how can we do things differently? How can we do things better? And can we make better marketable? Because, one of the things that's happening is, of course, that some of the antics, let's take Fox out of the equation, some of the antics we see on television and we're seeing in the blog sites is because it draws audience. Now, to a certain extent, you got to say it's up to the, we could review the Michael Jackson coverage and argue that question as well. It drew audience, and a lot of people thought, well, whoa, why are we doing that? Why is this getting so much attention? It got huge numbers. And, people want, and so if you're sitting there, running a news organization, I can tell you, one of the things you've got to answer for is you got to figure out how big your audience is. And if that's where your audience wants to be informed about, you got to deal with it. So to some extent, this is a cultural matter too. It's what the culture welcomes and what the culture wants. If people are really going to go to this kind of stuff, if that's what sells, that's what moves. I mean, it's sort of one of the first things we saw on the internet. The only people making money out of the internet in the first number of years were pornographers. There's a reason for that. And that is a question of sort of what, I think you're always going to have a down market quality in any society, robust society, but the question is, it is also true that good publications can sell. Look at The Economist, which has got a much bigger market here than it's got in the UK, where its home is. Look at the popularity of the International Herald Tribune. Look at what's happened to the Wall Street Journal as Rupert Murdoch, great surprise to a lot of people, came in and actually has improved the quality of that newspaper. It's a much better read now than it was, 5 years ago, in the sense they pump more sources into it. It's got much more of a news hull, and it's getting a much bigger audience as a result. I happen to think that high-quality journalism still has a home in American public life, but you've got to do it in an interesting way. I think you've got to put some resources into it. You can't do it always on the cheap. It's very hard for public television to do all that it could be. Frontline has, Bill Moyers has to go out and pass the hat in order to, that was hard work for him in his heyday when he was doing that. Frontline has to raise a lot of money. The NewsHour has to raise money. These are propositions that do depend upon the capacity of others to help support them if they're nonprofits. And in the case of CNN or something like that, this is also a business proposition. So, you want to have the best news quality you can, but there are the question of will the viewers come, and that's always the balancing act. And it's one of the other questions that I think that needs to be examined. I happen to have the privilege of teaching at the Kennedy School, and it's one of the questions that our Shorenstein Center on Politics and Media is asking all the time. Alex Jones, our director, just wrote a very good book on losing the news, which is something we're all very concerned about. Is, are Americans going to be sufficiently informed if we have a lot of this slugfest going on all the time? So these are tricky questions, but I really believe that there are individuals, and John and Dana are very good examples of this, and Frank has stood up for this, who really push for high-quality journalism. And it's always a struggle. How do you get it on the air? How do you get it out there? How do you persuade your masters, the gatekeepers, this is really, really good journalism? Frank Sesno has been doing specials and things like that since he left CNN, continues to do some of that, and I think they've been very good. But, to get on the air with those kind of things is not, I'm sure Frank would be the first to say, not always easy. Not always easy. Please. Sure. Right. The question was, how does the White House respond to this? How does it change opinion? Look, that's the crux of the leadership question. In a society that seems increasingly ungovernable, what do you do? Now, we had this same debate back in the late 1970s, coming out of Vietnam, then Watergate, failed president, president left in scandal. I happened to be working for him. The Ford administration, which was altogether too brief, and then an ineffectual administration with Jimmy Carter. By the late 70s, people were asking whether the country was governable or not. And Lloyd Cutler, among others, was pushing for a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution to create a parliamentary system because everybody thought you can't do it. And then along came the most improbable of figures. A fellow came in on his horse from the West. And everybody, Clark Clifford called him a dunce. And Reagan turned out to be a pretty good leader. And you could agree or disagree with his conservatism, but he turned out to be a good leader. And there was a sense in the country, just as there was when Franklin Roosevelt came in 1933, we finally have a leader in the White House again. It does make a difference. Quality of leadership does make a difference. And I think one of the real challenges for the Obama administration is how does this president, he's had a slide here in the last few weeks. And I think one of the big challenges is, can he not only stabilize the support levels on health care, but can he start to reverse the tide? Can he begin to build up support? I think we're about to get a health care reform bill passed that's going to be very, very unusual in terms of major social legislation in this country, and that is it may well pass without majority popular support in the country. And you're hard put to find many bills that have passed, major social legislation that's passed without majority support in the country. Medicare, 63% when it passed. Social Security, back in the 30s, there was no public opinion polls, but there was a big survey of newspapers, and they put it at about 78%. This would be very unusual to pass this without public support and have a divided country. And it would be extremely unusual to pass it without bipartisanship. Pat Moynihan, when he was up here, a wonderful senator, he used to tutor me on this in the Clinton White House, send me all this stuff and say, David, major social legislation always goes through great majorities with super majorities. And if you look back, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights I, Civil Rights II, all passed ultimately with super majorities in the Senate. To pass this with 53 votes, or whatever the number is going to be, ultimately, I think is not a good precedent. It's not healthy. It's not the way we ought to go, and it would be really, really positive if we had, the 7 or 8 senators coming in from the Republican side, and you had 68 or 69. It'd be a much healthier system. So I think there's a real issue for President Obama in trying to get health care done with as much public support as possible. To go to John King's point, it's going to be really important if they pass it to make sure it is seen to be working so people don't lose faith in it. And the way it's structured, they've got a good chance of doing that. A lot of the good things in terms of the public happen up front, and the costs come later because they're going to phase in the insurance reform like that. But a lot of the extension of, and the payments don't actually kick in for a few years. But the question of pre-existing conditions, that disappears the day after the legislation is signed into law. That's going to be positive. But the stimulus program, for most of the public has not seemed to be working. Economists all say it's working, but the public at large says it's not working. So people have got to see that. And then I think the president's got to figure out, can I get us to a point where we can govern? I think it's one of the critical challenges that runs through his presidency across the issues. Yes, sir. We should stop here in just a second, please. Humility. Civility. Well, they sort of go together, humility and civility. Well, I had a conversation in the White House today about this issue and with somebody who was pretty close to the president. And he said, look, if we abandon this quest for civility, we're sort of lost. I mean, that's so central to what his presidency was about. So they can't do that. They have to keep working on it. They have to keep trying to be the model, even if they get their heads beaten in. They have to be, I think, really, really respectful of others. Listen, engage in listening, and engage seriously in listening. It's interesting to see Teddy Kennedy's memoirs about Jimmy Carter. One of the things he said about Jimmy Carter was He took great pride in appearing to listen, but he didn't really listen to me. It's one of the reasons he ran against him. And they have to really do it. They have to engage in what's called deep listening. They've got to really understand what the other side is saying. I think they've got to keep the door open to Republicans. I think they've got to reach out. I think that they have got to work on the House to see if there's a way. There's this very strong sense in the House, then it does this better than I do, that among a lot of Republicans, that this bipartisan stuff is just lip service, that they're not serious, they don't have a place at the table, there are no proposals on the table that would really suggest Republican input. Whatever happened to malpractice reform, defensive medicine, whatever happened to preventive medicine, about keeping people well. There's very little of that in this bill. I just saw Andy Weil at the White House today. The Dr. Weil, he's a terrifically interesting guy. He cares deeply about where's preventive medicine. What about how people live and the nourishment and their exercise and all this? We're silent on that. It's not very. The bill is not, frankly, very tough about cost control. If you're really going to practice bipartisanship, you've got to be able to say more than I talk to you. It's got to be more. It's got to be. Let's see if we can explore that. I think the culture up here is really rough to change now in the House, and of course it's crept over into the Senate. I think it's going to be a long time. But one of the things I think is going to be the saving grace is the younger generation. I don't find that the bitterness that we're seeing among people in their 40s and 50s, and now a lot of the people who came to Washington this weekend were older. They were seniors. I find people in their 20s and 30s to be much more civic-minded and much more about renewal, much more caring about service, much more idealistic, frankly, much more spiritual, much more on a spiritual journey. What I tell students is, get in the arena as soon as possible. We really need you. We need your generation in the arena. Sometimes I despair of my generation. We have some wonderful leaders, but I think I happen to be sort of front end of the baby boom, the 1940, 1950 crowd. And I think we were a little too coddled. And frankly, we're still a little juvenile, adolescent. But I think the younger generation is a really terrific generation that's coming up. Last issue, and appropriately. Last question. You work for a global television station. Look, sure. Look, this is the great fight. It is the great fight of reporters on local newspapers who find the news hold is too small or there's too much boosterism in a local newspaper. It's the regional newspapers have cut down their news hold. It is the fight of the local reporter, with fighting off the if it bleeds, it leads kind of syndrome. It's increasingly the fight at the national level. There's a lot of if it bleeds, it leads at the national level too now. Or looking for the food fight or whatever it may be. And I think this is I think that the issue becomes for journalists not only how well you cover something, but what do you stand for? What are the standards that you're going to uphold as a journalist? What are your values, your principles? What's your true north as a journalist? What set of values and principles guide you in your journalism? And then if you're good at what you do, so you do the daily work really well, your voice is going to count for a lot more in the newsroom about what ought to get on the air and what ought not to be getting on the air. This is a daily struggle. You can ask the journalists who are in the room and struggle about what it is that's going to appear, what's going to be out there. Because the gatekeepers have their sets of values, and they're not always the same. And I think that you have no choice but to keep pushing on it. But it's also up to you to be creative about how to make it interesting. I can tell you the national service story is in what's going on among young people as social entrepreneurs and going out and creating nonprofits is a wonderfully interesting story of social change that's going on. The Wendy Kopp story is a terrific story. I happen to know Wendy. I happen to be on her board at Teach for America. And I can tell you what she's doing is marvelous. She's one of the most impressive people in America today to me. But getting that on the air is hard. Getting the KIPP schools on the air, getting the Seed School in Washington on the air, and what they're doing is hard work. Because it's sort of feel good, do good, that goes to the bottom of the stack. It doesn't have enough sort of blood and guts to it to really attract attention. But nonetheless, it's really important to go out and see if there are ways to make that interesting. I'm involved in a number of awards programs to award innovations in American government. I've been chairing that selection committee for a while. And I can tell you, we come across programs that are really fascinating that's going on in government. But try to get anybody to cover that. Sometimes you can get USA Today to cover it. We gave an award once to former prostitutes in San Francisco who had created this program that was going after Johns. It was a terrific program, but because the only reason it got on the air was because of prostitutes. That's the reason we got it out in the press. There's a piece in the Financial Times today about prostitutes in Africa who've turned things around, and it's now making national news. But to get, it took a long, long time to get micro-lending, what was going on at the Grameen Bank, to get that story out there. And, had it not been for the Nobel Prize, I'm not sure people would be covering it to this day. So there's a lot of good work going on. And one of the things that you have to do is now start using the internet, and universities need to be very supportive of this kind of thing. Universities need to be out at the forefront of standing for certain kind of values in societies. And this is the work of a board of a university. What is it we're trying to do to create here? What kind of culture are we trying to create among our students, among our alumni, that upholds certain kinds of models of behavior? And that's why you come in here and give awards to Mark and to Dana, because they represent the models of what you're trying to do. You cannot depend on journalism to do all of this work alone. You have to sort of encourage other ways in the society to thank people, salute people, to honor people, and to hold them up as role models. And even then, I think there's some hard questions. I think that to this day, the Van Jones story of this fellow who had to fall on his sword at the White House has not been really, we've not had a good conversation about it. I mean, this is a guy who paid a huge price, and he got sort of shuffled off. But, the story of what he's actually contributed to ex-cons out in California, and what he's done for a lot of, especially minority ex-cons, and the way he's gotten them jobs is one heck of a good story. And he got sort of like, he said these terrible things, and he started this radical group way back when. There's a lot more to Van Jones than that. He got turned into a cardboard cutout in that, and that's the role I think the press has to also be. You have to fight for how do we tell this story fairly? How do we make people three-dimensional? And it's not an easy, but that's why, again, it goes back to that's why this alliance that you're creating here is potentially so promising for the university, and to have good, strong people like you all. I happen to claim a very small tie to George Washington. Our son is a graduate of your public affairs program, so that's been, and he's an educational entrepreneur now. But I think this is a really enormously promising, and if you all can stay engaged, stay and stay tied in. And I can promise you, if you don't, the development office will make sure they find you anyway. But this is enormously promising. I appreciate the chance to be here for the opening. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. The voice and the perspective and the experience that you bring to this conversation really makes it unique, and I think we've all had a great opportunity this evening to hear someone who's thought about this very deeply and who's been in a position to influence it, both at the White House and several White Houses and in the media. But it brings me back, if I may, for just a moment, and then I really don't want to get between you and your food. I'll be very, very brief, to let you know what we're doing about this. Because, David, I think there is a place for universities, a very important place. And one of the things we're trying to do at the School of Media and Public Affairs is actually to provide the three dimensions for people who are working on behalf of this country. It's one of the reasons we have the conversation series that we do, to bring people to the university. I think a university has an opportunity not to become a network or to become a producer, but we've got the platform, we've got the location, we've got the credibility, we've got the energy, we've got the diverse community that can engage these issues. With the technology that we've got, with our cameras, with our access to the internet, we can share that conversation and take the journalism that our young people are doing, our students are doing, that these guys are doing, and share that more broadly. It's a very democratizing experience, and to wrap it in the intellectual framework that we can wrap it in gives it that extra dimension, which I think is very important. Let me tell you how moving it is. I teach a course called Art and Genre of Documentary. It is the greatest course. We start with Edward R. Murrow. Actually, we started with Nanook of the North, 1922, Edward R. Murrow, and right up through, say what you will about him, Michael Moore and Ken Burns and others. But a student came up to me on the first day and he said, "Professor Sesno, would you read this and tell me what you think of it?" And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's my documentary proposal." And it was a binder with a treatment, with a proposal to raise $40,000 for him to go across Africa and chronicling the World Cup. And as he goes, looking at how people live and how different demographics and different races and classes come together and clash together over soccer. A tremendously creative idea, with the world as his perspective. Or the student who's interning at National Geographic, reading documentary proposals and helping to make decisions about what goes forward or what doesn't. Or the student who's already been at 60 Minutes, learning among some of the best true journalists. She's been there for 6 months and part of that discussion. Or the kid who came into me today and who's so excited because he's about to launch his internship in the Situation Room and work with Wolf Blitzer and Dana and all the others at CNN. So this does continue. And what we tell them is engage, be creative, be tough, and know what matters. So it is a time of really great worry in what is happening in journalism, and yet phenomenal opportunity because all these new seeds are putting down their roots at the same time. So Reagan told this great story about the optimist and the pessimist. I'm the optimist because there is a pony in there somewhere, and there's dessert here, and we'd like you to stay engaged. Our students, our faculty, the whole university is very much dependent and very much proud of the association here, and I hope the Luther Rice Society and these alliances can really flourish, and we'll all help in any way we can. So mingle, enjoy your dessert. David, Dana, President Knapp, thank you very, very much.
Not that we want anyone to leave.